in Alberta. United Conservative Party leader Jason Kenney was sworn in earlier today as the province's 18th premier. Kenney's new government takes office with a list of priorities based on campaign promises. High on the list, the battle against Ottawa's carbon tax initiative. Alberta and several other provinces are determined to roll back new rules imposed by the federal government. Another top priority, getting Alberta's petroleum products to coastal waters for shipment to overseas markets. The CBC's Carolyn Dunn is in Edmonton with more on what the future holds for Jason Kenney and for Albertans. Hey, Carolyn, great to see you.
Great to see you.
So he's taken on the role, Mr. Kenney, Premier Kenney, of intergovernmental relations in addition to being premier. What kind of signal does that send?
Well, you know, it's not that unusual. Rachel Notley and Alison Redford before him were also intergovernmental affairs ministers. But I think that there's a real significance to Premier Kenney taking that on. If you kind of look at the issues that are front and center for him, pipelines, you know, it's all federal. Emissions caps, that's also part of the deal that the federal government struck with Alberta in order to buy the Trans Mountain pipeline. If Alberta is to repeal its own carbon tax, there's going to be, you know, lots of negotiations with the federal government, and the federal government has a carbon tax as a backstop. And then, of course, dealing with BC on whether, you know, it's ever going to allow a pipeline to get Alberta resources to Tidewater and Quebec too. So you've got a very experienced federal cabinet minister. So it's probably not a surprise that he would want to take it on. But I just think the scope of issues that are facing Alberta right now and are on Premier Kenney's priority list are what makes it kind of an obvious choice that he would want his own fingerprints and hands on all of those files.
When the Premier was discussing those subjects, Carolyn, on the campaign trail, the rhetoric was very pointed, was kind of amped up. What about now?
Yeah, well, you know, the underlying message really hasn't changed that much. It's basically, you know, we're going to plow through any of our opponents that try to, you know, stop our oil and gas industry from getting back on track, whether that's environmentalists or whether that's governments. But the tone today was a lot different. It was conciliatory, if you will. I'm just trying to think of a couple of examples of that. Premier Kenney came out and said that, yes, we're going to enact this BC turn off the taps legislation and get it ready to go, but we actually don't have any, you know, intention of using it right away. On the issue of emissions caps, he says, yes, we're going to scrap Rachel Notley's climate plan, but when it comes to emissions caps, we don't actually have any intention right now of amending any legislation and lowering any kind of emission limits. So he has really sort of taken a lighter tone, and I think this clip sort of demonstrates that tone if we want to take a listen to it.
I indicated to Prime Minister Trudeau when we spoke 2 weeks ago that we would be happy to sit down with the federal government and try to seek common ground on a variety of issues. But one thing that for us is completely non-negotiable is the repeal of the retail carbon tax, which will be done in Bill 1 of the legislature, which we intend to convene on May the 21st.
And if he doesn't get his way, I bet you we're going to see fiery Kenney back.
All right. Thank you, Carolyn. The CBC's Carolyn Dunn for us in Edmonton.
I'm so proud of this team. It's diversity, a young team. I believe it may be the youngest cabinet of any provincial government in Canada. So I'm very pleased with all of these ministers and looking forward to getting to work this afternoon and in the 4 years ahead as we seek to keep our word with Albertans and to implement our 375 positive ideas on which we ran and for which we received an historic mandate just 2 weeks ago.
Alberta's new premier was sworn in earlier this afternoon. Jason Kenney is the province's 18th premier. He named 20 people to his cabinet and created a few new portfolios. What do his choices indicate about what he wants to get done and how he plans to do it? Let's bring in the power panel. In Calgary, the only guy named Jason not named to cabinet today. There are now 4 with that given name in cabinet. Jason Markisoff of Maclean's. Tiffany Gooch of Enterprise and Insight Canada is in Toronto. And here with me in studio, former Conservative Cabinet Minister Stockwell Day, alongside political commentator and former NDP MP Françoise Boivin. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. Happy Tuesday. Jason, I'll start. I have to start with you. Your overall
sense. Jason looking out, yeah.
Yeah, Jason, not in cabinet. Your overall sense of what today indicates.
Today's been an interesting day. It's been interesting to see who's the cabinet. The cabinet names are not terribly surprising. He picked some people who were new members. His finance minister is a new rookie, former head of the Cattlemen Association. His justice minister was a former a leadership rival against him. He didn't really pick many people who'd been in his caucus before. He picked a lot of the new faces. There's a pipeline expert running the Ministry of Pipelines and Energy. What I'm more so looking forward to is actually see what he does with his cabinet on this first day. He had spoken about enacting within an hour of his government being sworn in this turn off the taps legislation. It's several hours so far, and I haven't heard anything yet. We'll see how much his actual rhetoric meets reality, and that's what we're going to see, not with who is in cabinet, but more what he winds up doing and how his tone changes now that he's in office.
Let's talk about tone a little bit, Stockwell, because we are expecting him to come to Ottawa later this week. I don't think it's confirmed that he's going to meet with the Prime Minister, but I imagine that will be on the table. He's Intergovernmental Affairs Minister as well as Premier. The tone has shifted a little bit since the campaign, which kind of makes sense, I guess. What do you think we should expect of that relationship?
Tone is a great point to start, because you saw something. I'll use an example. A couple days ago, there was a story about somebody resigning, and the person was called Energy Advisor. I think that was a bit of a misnomer, but they said they couldn't support his policy. And usually when something like that happens, you got a new premier coming in, and all of a sudden I suppose a key person is going to resign, there's panic. And the HR people are all saying, oh, the media's raising this, and it's a terrible thing. And his response was, however people want to say it, was, I'm glad he resigned the day before we fired him. In other words, he's setting a tone. He's not going to be out looking to get people upset, but he's not going to be the type of person, this government is not going to be the type of government that will run when there's a, quote, media issue. They'll listen, they'll evaluate, they'll take their time and they'll make a statement.
I think he had promised to fire that guy. He worked for the Alberta Energy Regulator. Jason, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And he basically,
that's right.
Yeah, and he had said, I'm going to fire them anyway. And you think that tone indicated what in the tweet?
Indicated that this government is going to be very much of their own mind. And we live in a day, and Vashi, you would know, you see it all around you, where there is a tendency when something, quote, negative happens, especially politically, everybody runs for cover, right? And on so many of these issues, he's pushed back. Look at the environmental issues. He's going to deal with environment and the economy together. He wants pipelines to go ahead. Jason mentioned the person who's put in charge, very, if I can use the word, energetic woman as Minister of Energy, very smart. So, they're going to reach out and they're going to try and be good partners in Confederation, but they've really sent a clear message right from the start, as the Premier did when Premier-elect with his, or Premier now, with his opening speech on election night, reaching out in French to Quebec. Whether it was successful or not, we don't know, but you're going to see a very different style here.
So I guess it depends, Tiffany, on how you interpret it, because I saw some people supportive of that tweet that Premier Kenney sent out, but I also saw people say, really? Like, you're gonna, is that becoming of someone in that position? So I'm guessing it depends on where you sit on the political spectrum.
For sure, and I think there's going to be a varying viewpoint of how he's doing, and ultimately the expectations at this point are going to be quite high for him. He's set them up for himself to be that high, and so everything that he says will be, I think, viewed and closely how hard he comes out the gate in terms of each of the things that he's been saying he's going to do. I found it really interesting, the size of the cabinet, 20 people plus 2 associate ministers, someone very specific focused on mental health and addictions. I thought that was interesting. And then I think aside from that, a lot of borrowed messaging from Ontario, red tape reduction, open for business. And I think this is going to be a time where he also sort of needs to be able to differentiate. And for all of what he said he's going to do, hours out of some of those commitments already, this is going to be a sort of a difficult space for how he speaks to all of the different audiences that he's communicating to.
Françoise, if there is common ground with the federal government in that meeting that we think will occur at some point this week, what is it?
Oh my goodness, I don't at this point in time even foresee one. I think it's just going to be a polite first meeting to set some grounds. I think we know where Jason Kenney sits, and I think the federal government still has to make their own position clear. I took notice of the fact that, as a Quebecer, of the fact that Jason Kenney kept the portfolio of intergovernmental affair. I'm sure Quebec is watching closely also, because in Quebec it's Minister Sonia Lebel, who's intergovernmental affair. So the premier in Quebec might decide to take over the file at some point in time, because I don't think Jason Kenney will talk with ministers. He will want to talk to premiers and to the prime minister. Same thing in the federal cabinet with Dominique Leblanc out of commission. I think it's Bill Morneau who's acting intergovernmental affair right now. But I do think the prime minister will have to take that file. So is there common ground? I think the common ground is the jobs, is making sure economy, because that's what the federal government keeps saying that they're champions of. And that's basically the message from Jason Kenney I've been hearing, notwithstanding his 375 good ideas. The number one that people, I'm sure, that resonates in Alberta and everywhere in Canada, Quebec also, everywhere, is jobs and make the economy grow on the eve of not a recession, but an economy won't be as easy as it has been in the last few years.
Jason, the first thing that the Premier promised to do was repeal the carbon tax. He also spoke during the campaign about lifting a cap on emissions, but sort of walk that back a little bit. I want to play a clip and then get your impression of it. Let's take a listen.
Producer on Earth, and that will not change. We are nowhere close to hitting a cap, and we have not committed to amending the legislation which imposes the emissions cap. I indicated to Prime Minister Trudeau when we spoke 2 weeks ago that we would be happy to sit down with the federal government and try to seek common ground on a variety of issues. But one thing that for us is completely non-negotiable is the repeal of the retail carbon tax, which will be done in Bill 1 of the legislature, which we intend to convene on May the 21st.
So, Jason, that was interesting to me because in my conversations with people in the Prime Minister's office in the lead up to the election day, that emissions cap was actually something that really stuck out to them. They were wondering, oh boy, are we going to have to try and do something even though we can't really because it's provincial jurisdiction? And this was a central part of why they haven't even had it written into the Order in Council in the initial approval of TMX. So what is that? What is the words that he said today signal to you?
And in Bill C-69, this bill that he dreads, one of their conditions on not regulating some of the oil sands projects was keeping this plan in place. I thought it was very fascinating as well that Kenney has started walking that back. It wasn't explicitly in the platform, but when reporters were briefed from the platform, Kenney's senior officials told us that was part of the plan. For him to compromise on this shows at least that he's willing to pick his battles. He's going to go to war on with BC potentially on this whole turn off the taps thing. He's going to fight on the carbon tax. He's going to fight on pipelines. But if this oil sands cap thing, which is a bit nebulous because, as Kenney himself said, no company or the oil sands isn't anywhere near hitting this. Oil sands companies actually seem to like this policy because it gives some sense to the public and the environmentalists that eventually there will be an end to emissions. I think it would be quite savvy for Kenney to slow walk that at very least at this point.
Stock, do you agree?
I do. I mean, he's laid out some pretty strong messages, and it's a bit of, some people might see it as contrarian opinion when you look across the country, but what he's focusing on, he's tying in environment, and he's tying in jobs in the economy, and he's saying, hold on a minute here, whether we're talking pipelines, whether we're talking carbon tax, he's willing to have the discussion and say, look, we don't think the carbon tax really works. And we'd like a discussion on that. Now, he's obviously going to take some legislative action. He feels that strongly about it. I think that's important, that on topics that are, this is a pretty controversial topic, but that we can have a discussion without the name calling. He's bringing that to the national stage because it's a provincial issue, but he's forcing the discussion. I heard a newscaster, not here, just yesterday say, well, when are we going to see a policy that stops the flooding? And I went, policy that stops the flooding? What are we talking about, you know?
Well, probably, maybe they're asking about climate change policy.
Yeah, but that's not going to stop the flooding. But what he's done, he's bringing the whole thing up to the discussion level. And he's saying, here's what we're going to do in Alberta. And by the way, can the rest of us just talk about this? And I think that's a huge advancement to just name calling people. If they want to take a different approach, you're not a denier, you're not this, you're not that. You just want to take a look at this and see what is really causing things.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.